Today we'll talk about habits, and we will detail the negative and positive effects of, I guess, your everyday habits. And I think it's also important to talk about, I guess, the sort of dopamine levels that certain habits may release and the long-term detriments of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also using maybe a three-pronged approach where we look at, say, a really extreme example and the implications that extreme dopamine releasing behaviors have. Maybe looking at one that's a bit middle, something that perhaps is pretty common among people but still has high dopamine releasing consequences. And then I think also talking about just a really everyday example.
I think if you look at your day as a singular event, everything you do tends to have a reason. You go to work, you get paid. Then everything after that, you may do an array of things after work. Say you had a really stressful day at work, you go home and binge eat. You know, why you're doing that and what are the sort of triggers you can identify to say this habit's probably negative, and then implement things to change it. I think that's two separate steps.
I think also the binge eating is just a good example of the overall point that we're trying to make. So say if we do use binge eating as an example, well, yeah, identifying, well, first of all, do you perceive that to be a negative habit? Why do you perceive that to be a negative habit? And how can you ultimately change that behavior to something positive? Because I feel like we've all had that experience where we've identified we want to change our behavior in some aspects. We've gone a few days really well, not engaging in it, but then ultimately we end up just falling back into that behavioral habit. Well, why does that occur? And how can you actually be successful in changing negative habits?
I think a key part of that is, just identifying that this is bad for me is not enough if you don't have something to replace it with. If you just stop binge eating, for example, but just sit at home doing nothing, it's going to be very easy to fall back into that habit. But if you, for example, say, when I get home from work, instead of going straight to the kitchen, I'm going to go for a run or go to the gym or have something to replace that with, it's going to have a much more beneficial long-term effect, and it's going to be much easier to maintain that. What do you think?
No, I absolutely agree. Just identifying that as negative, like you said, is not enough.
Yeah, I agree.
You have to have a reason of, well, why am I ultimately wanting to change my behavior? We always talk about goals and having direction and meaning. You do have to, I think, dig into, well, what is my direction? Why do I feel like it's a meaningful change that I'm making in my life? Are there certain goals that align with this behavioral change? I think being self-aware of those things would be extremely beneficial.
I guess my question to you would be, suppose you wanted to change some negative habits. Would the replacement of these habits have to be something that align with your long-term goals for you to stick with them? So if you're just replacing whatever it is, we'll go back to binge eating with going for a run, but maybe you're not particularly interested in fitness or being healthy, is that going to be much harder to maintain that replacement habit?
I mean, absolutely. I think the thing that you're replacing the behavior with has to be meaningful to you. I don't think it's good enough just to go, well, I know that binge eating's unhealthy, like being overweight, it's unhealthy. I do need to make a change. Like everyone pushes people towards running and exercising and stuff. But that ultimately doesn't really reflect my internal motivation. Yeah. It's not necessarily that I want to be some marathon runner in the future or something like that. Binge eating is a difficult one because the modern foods are very, I suppose, even engineered in a way that are almost highly addictive to our natural inclination towards like high fat foods and stuff like that. The food is a difficult one to get into, but ultimately to answer your question, you have to have meaning behind why you're changing your behavior.
I would agree. I think it's hard to stick to something if it doesn't align with you in the longer term. But it's not just binge eating, negative behaviors and habits come in all different shapes and forms. In terms of steps to identify that, or looking at kind of stress responses, like why do you binge eat? Why do you go home, sit on your phone all day? Even porn, I think all these things are detrimental in the long run. How do you identify them? And then would you say negative habits are as a result of some sort of stress response to everyday life, or?
I mean, negative habits, it is very subjective. Obviously, there are going to be some negative habits that are much more dopamine releasing, say. Because obviously, when we're talking about negative habits, usually we're talking about things that do release high levels of dopamine and are often novel in their structure, I suppose. So something like binge eating, high sugar foods release a lot of dopamine. Ultimately, I think there is this thing where when we feel stressed out, we look to things that release high dopamine because ultimately we're feeling some lack of that. Yep. The stressful event has made us feel all these negative emotions, and that high potency dopamine behavior, in some sense, helps us escape those negative emotions. So to answer your question, yes, negative behaviors do correlate to stressful events, yeah.
I definitely agree in regards to if you're going through some sort of tough time, you tend to look for these high dopamine activities in the sense of going out, in the sense of binge eating, whatever it is. And I think food definitely plays a part in that, especially high sugar food releases massive amount of dopamines. You have a good chocolate or whatnot. In terms of steps to, I guess, replace them or identify them, how are people doing that?
I think an easier example for us to focus on might be actually the porn addiction.
Yeah, or just phone.
Especially for like men in general. I would say that we are hardwired in a way that sex is important to us.
100%. Everyone wants to get off.
Exactly. So looking at, well, why is porn so stimulating to young men?
Yeah.
I think it has something to do with we are driven and motivated to better ourselves so that in the future we can be more attractive to a potential partner. It's not a holistic perspective, and there are obviously other reasons why people are motivated to do things, interests, etc. But we are definitely motivated to become a better version of ourselves so that we can be more attractive to, say, a more high value future partner. So when you're looking at the porn example, porn disrupts that natural motivation process. So I think when you're looking at young men especially, it's inhibiting them from going out into the world and making something of themselves, basically. It's a complex issue because, or why are they falling into those behaviors? Is it because they're feeling stressed out? Is it because their maybe family life isn't that great? Are they in a circumstance where every day is hell, so they're just looking to escape? Or is it that society has been pushing them in this direction through social media, or even there has been this just wide acceptance of porn in general society, I would say. There isn't that much communication on actually the negative outcomes of it. I think even us touching on that a little bit would be quite beneficial.
Oh, definitely. I think if you look at porn as a whole and you would ask yourself, are young kids, particular males, addicted to it? The answer is yes. But where do you ever see online, on the news, on social media, the negative effects of it? And the answer is probably nowhere. Yeah. It's just like, as a society, we've accepted that this is just normal, when in fact it's not. And I think the harmful effects are not really outlined anywhere, and it's probably a much more detrimental thing than it is beneficial in the long term.
I mean, if you look at, say, what makes a male attractive, would you not agree that it's their level of competence in, say, the workplace, how much they can financially provide? how much even they look after their physical health, their mental health. Ultimately, down the track, a good partner has to have these areas taken care of so that they can provide in the best way possible to their future partner, their future family, say. So it is actually a very prevalent issue, this topic. Like, if young men aren't stepping up and I suppose taking responsibility and going out and actually developing themselves, like, there is a wider conversation to be had, I would definitely say.
Definitely, but why do you think people are resulting to these sort of habits? Is it that instant dopamine hit? I mean, you don't have to get out there in the real world. You can just go on your phone and straight away you get that instant sort of gratification. Is that what's deterring people from, perhaps these kind of traditional values of going out there, kind of being confident, talking to people, whereas you can just, as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, you can just jump on your phone and get that instant hit?
Well, it does get back to this thing of what path do you want to follow?
Yeah.
Do you want to follow the instant gratification pathway, or do you want to follow the pathway that is delay of gratification for something better in the future? It's not a clear concept because we've questioned this before. Why would you give up positive feeling now for something that is just an idea in the future? It's not concrete.
Yeah.
You need to get really clear on that question.
You'd probably have to ask yourself if you'd want to do that. It's the kind of idea of, why should I give up today for something that's not guaranteed in a year or 2 years or 3 years? I think there's benefit in sacrificing today, but if you're not self-aware of why you're doing what you're doing, it's going to be hard to stick with it. But if we go back to the habit, let's just look at porn, for example. If someone is addicted to porn, what can they do? They're coming home after work, they're stressed, they had a pretty crappy day. All they want to do is just get on their phone. What's the steps to alleviate themselves from that sort of habit?
I think the first step would be identifying that you're actually stressed.
Yep.
Identifying that the situation you just came out of has produced these negative emotions. Can you either A, not put yourself in that situation, or B, find better ways to cope with the negative emotions and the stress? There's going to be stress involved with work. There's going to be stress involved with daily life, of course, but it's about how you respond to those situations. If the stressful situation is so overwhelming, you might have the only option is to just not expose yourself to that stress anymore. You might need to find a new job. You might need to find a new relationship, say. But yeah, firstly, it would be identifying that you are stressed and the cause of that stress. I think the next thing you'd want to look at is, well, what's triggering the behavior? So if the behavior is watching porn, well, what would be triggering that response? Like, you can obviously look at things don't just progress all the way in one go. Say you're on your phone, you're on the internet, you're scrolling through Instagram or something like that, and you see a really attractive woman. Does that not trigger a thought process that ultimately leads you in the direction of, say, porn? Like, it's pretty clear that would have a direct correlation to that behavior.
I agree. I think the longer you're probably sitting on your phone during those times, the more likely you are to go and do that.
Yeah.
So perhaps the first step would be saying, maybe at 7 o'clock at night, I'm off my phone until I go to sleep. Is that, do you think, a good first step to trying to break these habits, or is that, too much too early?
It's, again, subjective.
Yeah.
What's right for you might not be right for someone else. Maybe you have to be as extreme as, well, I'm deleting all social media because every time I go on there, I end up engaging in these behaviors that I don't want to behave in. Some people might be further along the line where they can just go on every now and then, and it doesn't break it doesn't make them engage in those behaviors. But for some people, putting strict rules in place would definitely be beneficial. So I suppose when you switch gears a little bit to maybe something like weight loss, it's a pretty common issue. I think obesity especially in societies like America and Australia. I don't know the exact statistics, but it's definitely more than half of the population are obese. So what are the steps that someone can take, I suppose, when they're trying to break unhealthy eating patterns, or perhaps increasing positive habits like going to the gym, exercising, etc.? Maybe you can dig in, I suppose, to some steps that people can take to achieve this.
Yeah, I think in the case of weight loss, and say you're in a bit of a rut and, you know, you got some negative habits there, it's going to be very hard to just wake up one day and say, I'm going to stop my negative eating habits and I'm just going to run a marathon tomorrow, right? You're going to destroy your body. You're going to be sore. You're probably going to fracture some bones in your body, and you're never going to want to exercise again. So I think the key to in that situation would be kind of just that cold exposure a little bit at a time. So for example, you would try and change one thing at a time. Suppose you get home from work and you have quite a rubbish diet. You're just going to say to yourself, this week, I'm just going to change my diet. I'm not even going to worry about exercising. I'm not even going to run 500 meters or a K or 2 or 3 or 4 Ks. I'm just going to change one part of my diet. Then you do that for a week, and all of a sudden you got a little bit of momentum. And then perhaps the next week you're going to say, you know what, I might go for a run. I might just go and walk around the block. I don't even have to run, right? Then the week after that, you might go for a 100-meter run around the block. And you do that for a week, and then before you know it, you've went from changing one dietary habit to all of a sudden, for the first time in the last 2 or 3 years, you can run 2 Ks, right? And maybe you're running 2 Ks for a month or two. And before you know it, you can run 5 Ks. Now, it's not necessarily about the pace or how hard you're pushing yourself. It's the fact that you slowly and surely, one step at a time, change those habits. And before you know it, you're 6 months in, 9 months in, and your friends are saying, Seb, you look great. You've dropped so much weight. Your clothes are loose on you. And before you know it, you look back and you've lost 20 kilos or 20 pounds. So I think the key to it is when you are in a bit of a rut and you've gone quite downwards the opposite way, to approach it slowly. Because as I said, if you just wake up one day and try and change everything all at once, it's going to be very hard to stick with it. But if you slowly implement little techniques, I'm going to change my diet, I'm going to start eating healthier meals, I'm going to slowly start walking, I'm going to slowly start running. You look back in a year or 9 months, you've lost 25 pounds, 25 kilos, and you feel great. And then it's much easier to maintain that over the next 2 years than if you just changed everything overnight.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. It's like the manageable incremental steps that you can take rather than just taking that huge leap that often brings up anxiety and fear in people and lends itself to being so overwhelming that they can't even engage in the behavior. I think the other thing is when you approach something like weight loss, so many people focus on the numbers on the scale.
Yeah.
Would you agree, and maybe you can go into it a little bit more, but would it be more about the action steps you're taking? Like say you're running 100 meters today, you're running 500 next week, and you're running a kilometer the week after. Would it be more about that rather than, oh, I've dropped a kilo this week, I want to drop 2 next week? Would it be more about the actions that you can take rather than the numbers on the scale?
I mean, look, I'm not a dietitian and I'm definitely no expert on the field, but I think what's most important is the actions. But the actions at the end of the day have to lead to a numbers on a scale.
But I suppose that's the point I'm getting at. The behaviors and the actions is what going to be driving the actual eventual weight loss. If you're just focusing on the weight loss, you're not getting the bigger picture.
Yeah.
It's the behaviors that go into it that ultimately lead to the result.
That's right. It's the routine and the behaviours that are going to drive
Yeah.
the numbers on the scale decreasing.
Yeah.
But if the numbers on the scale aren't decreasing after 12 months, you're probably not sticking to those behaviours and actions.
And you probably need to push it further.
You probably do, yeah. But yeah, I would agree in saying that it's much more important to stick to a routine and have constant behaviours that you are doing as opposed to just weighing yourself every day. I mean, to lose weight or in regards to any goals, you would have to have a degree of long-term planning. Would you say that's accurate?
Of course, there's going to be a biological element to goal setting, say. And when you look at something like the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that is responsible for critical thinking and basically long-term planning. And there is, of course, in any area of the brain, there's going to be quite a lot of variability person to person. I think the question is, well, say you're someone that hasn't really got that much of a developed prefrontal cortex, say. You could easily go, oh, my biology's against me. I'm just going to throw my hands up and give up. But I really do think that's the wrong perspective to have. In some sense, we all have talents and we all have weaknesses. I think we all are ultimately fighting the battle of our lives. And it's not that your battle is any worse than mine. Ultimately, it's different. So you need to identify what are your challenges and how can I work to overcome that. It's not about what you're going through. Yeah. It's about where are my weaknesses? Where's my journey? Where do I want to go with things? So in talking about the biology of it, I think it would be interesting to sort of tangent into something that I'm quite interested in. I've looked at a lot of experiences of recovering drug addicts, and there was one in particular. He was addicted to methamphetamine for over 5 years. And at the point when I started watching his journey, I think he was like 3 years sober or something like that. Basically, he outlined that every drug addict never fully recovers. They're basically always in a state of recovery. And I think if you read between the lines, it gets back to this thing of your brain is hardwired in a way that it remembers high potency reward situations. So when you look at something like methamphetamine, there's been studies on how potent it actually is. And if you look at the scale, something like an orgasm during sex, it's 100 on that scale. Whereas methamphetamine is 1,000.
And 10x.
So it's a 10x reward on something that's already a potent stimuli. So when you look at something like goal setting, why would a meth addict delay gratification and stick to a goal in the future when they know that they could go off and smoke meth tomorrow and get a higher reward than the one that they've waited 2 years for in the future? Ultimately, it doesn't make sense. And I suppose the reason I'm bringing up that example, it's an extreme example because not everyone's smoking meth, but it says something about the behaviors you choose to engage in. It's not true that you can just open a door with the perspective that in the future I can just shut that door. It's not how it works. Your brain remembers high potency reward behaviors. Knowing that, would you be so careless with the behaviors that you choose to engage in if you know that if I come across something that is so rewarding, it's going to make doing hard things difficult in the future?
It's a very interesting point. There's a lot to unpack probably in what you just said there. But I think, yes, meth isn't something, your everyday person would engage in, but I think that can be applied to probably drugs as a whole.
Yeah.
Would you open the door in your brain to something that your brain is going to compare against probably for the rest of your life?
This guy, he said that 3 years sober, he was still dreaming about meth every single night. And of course, not everyone's smoking meth like we said, but you need to understand that your behaviors have consequences. We're not living in a world where you can just change and flip around all the time. We are limited by our biological system.
Would you say doing something like that, once you've opened the door to something like methamphetamines, once that door's there in your brain, is it irreparable? Are you always, for the rest of your life, going to have that constant comparison where you may find other ways to release dopamine, but is your brain constantly going to be going, this was a thousand levels on the dopamine scales and something like an orgasm's 100?
Yeah.
how can you possibly, how can you possibly
Move forward.
and replicate that sort of dopamine when your brain's so accustomed to it for so long?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you look at something like stress response, research has found that when you engage in a behavior, your brain creates connections, basically. It's bad habits, it's good habits, it's both. So when you change, say you have engaged in a bad habit for 5 years and you've created all of these connections and you've made a change in your life, say, and now you're 2 years down the track and you've created all of these other connections, positive ones, say. When stressful situations occur, what actually happens is you revert back to the original habit.
Yeah.
Through stress, the new connections that were positive basically flip. So it gets back to what we were saying about once you open the door, you can't close it.
I think there's a few key things to note to what you just said. In regards to habits, say you are down a ditch. The longer you're down in this hole, the harder it is to change the habit, would you say?
Yeah, of course.
Also, though, what we're kind of detailing here and what you've just kind of outlined, not only is it harder to change a habit if you've been doing it for, say, 5 to 10 years, but it's also much easier to never engage in a habit.
Exactly.
As opposed to do it for 5 years and try and change it. Because your brain doesn't have that connection to make. If you never smoke, if you never do drugs, if you never do meth, your brain's not going to know what it's like.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to say to yourself, this is negative, so therefore I'm never going to do it, as opposed to say, even if I get addicted, I can just, try and change 10 years down the track or whatnot. Would you agree with that?
You're ultimately correct.
Yeah.
The difficult thing about trying to change your behaviors is that, and it's positive and negative. If you look in the context of never engaging in a drug, so you never know what it feels like, that's obviously a positive thing.
Yeah.
Like if we all knew what it was like to smoke meth, we'd probably be smoking meth right now. So in some sense, there is a positive aspect to it. But there's also the negative in that, well, if I want to change my behavior to something positive, I can think about it all day long and I can tell myself, yeah, it'll be great if I have a habit of every morning I wake up and I go for a run. But because you've never experienced that and you don't know what it's going to be like and you don't know what feelings are going to go along with it, you're going to have a really hard time motivating yourself to do it. Just because your brain, it doesn't understand like it's a positive thing. You can consciously justify it to yourself, but biologically, it just stands there as basically nothing.
Yeah.
So the question is, if my biology isn't motivating me to do something, how can I do it?
Well, you've got to have that mental discipline. I do ultimately believe that you can escape out of any bad habit, whether you've been doing it for 5 years or 5 months or 50 years. I do think if you have the willpower, you can control your brain and change any habit. I think the point I would make is that's a much harder way of doing it as opposed to identifying it from day one and saying, that's a bad habit. I shouldn't get my brain accustomed to that. I think for people watching, if they knew that once your brain makes those connections with very high dopamine release activities, it's very hard to break that connection. I think people would be probably more wary of perhaps going out and doing substances and doing things that in the long run they probably know are detrimental.
Even porn.
I mean, porn's a great example.
I'm pretty sure like they've found that it's more addicting than cocaine.
Porn is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Obviously because porn is more widely available, but in terms of if you start watching porn and you have a cocaine habit, you're probably more likely to watch porn than you are to do cocaine.
Yeah, right. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But porn is one of those things that, I mean, you look at young people, they're just readily addicted to it. People are coming home, sitting on their phones and just watching porn for hours on end.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? And what is it about that instant gratification, that instant dopamine that people are seeking to, as opposed to just going out there and having a chat to people?
I think it's a multifaceted issue. I do think there's been an element of social justification in the behavior.
Yeah.
If society wasn't geared in a way that it was acceptable to watch and even encouraged, then there probably wouldn't be as widely, the behaviors probably wouldn't be as widely encouraged.
Yeah.
The other thing is, it's widely available. Men are obviously hardwired in a way that their sexuality is directly correlated to their vision. So porn is obviously very visual. So even on Instagram and stuff like that, as soon as you see like a sexually provocative image, your brain basically lights up. Whereas for women, they have found that it's more actually, pornography is more literary and novel based. But for men, it's a visual thing. So obviously there's a issue there about how it's being distributed, and there's an issue to do with the social acceptance of it. I think ultimately today we should be talking about, well, how can you get out of that behavior?
I think in the case of that, do you think it's more progressive? Like someone had a stressful day, they come home, they sit on their phone for a couple of hours. Then after being on their phone for a couple of hours, then they're going and, engaging in those activities. Do you think that sort of progresses from say you see a provocative image on Instagram, on Facebook, then your brain makes that connection, then you go to a porn site. Is that what's happening? Or is it just, this is so widely accepted in society that people are just doing it without any sort of idea of the harmful effects?
It's both.
Yeah.
And you're correct, it is a progression. Again, touching on the biology of it. Novel situations bring out the most dopamine out of any behavior. And what I mean by novel is a behavior that is unique. So say on Instagram, you see an attractive woman. The first time you see it, a lot of dopamine release. Yeah. The second time you see it, a little bit less. The third time you see it, a little bit less. So what this basically leads to is you're going to need a more stimulating or stimuli in the future to get the same response. Eventually, you'll go from just looking on Instagram to now you're watching actual videos, etc. So that is the way the progression works biologically.
Look, we're not clinical psychologists, but porn as a whole is just detrimental to you. You know, it devalues you, that nothing good comes out of it. So in terms of stopping those sort of habits, I would say you'd probably have to come home towards the end of the night and say, I'm just not going to touch my phone. Do you have to replace it with another habit? Could you go to the gym? Could you exercise? Of course, but you probably need to take a different approach to that as you would weight loss, where you're sort of dipping your toe in and slowly changing over time. You'd probably just have to say, I'm going to cut all contact at a certain point in time. Is that something you'd agree with, or do you think you can probably dip your toes in and change it in that regard?
I do think it's subjective, but the male proclivity to engage in sexual behavior and be motivated by sexual behavior is pretty high. I would say that porn and things of a sexual nature are much more dopamine provoking than, say, eating fast food and stuff like that. So
100%.
You do have to look at, well, what is the behavior that I'm trying to change? Of course, if you're smoking meth, you have to have zero contact, basically. The guy we were talking about earlier in the example said that if he was left in a room alone with meth, he would smoke it 100%.
Yeah.
Porn is not meth, but it's more than fast food, chips and chocolate.
Yeah.
So
it's not as addictive as meth.
No.
But it's probably more addictive than a binge eater.
Correct.
Or someone who's, on a weight loss journey.
Correct.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we probably covered 3 different levels on that spectrum of addiction or habit change. I think when you look at the methamphetamine example, what you're taking away from that is I should perhaps restrict my brain to certain activities that I know it's going to struggle to restrict in the future. I think when you look at the porn example, you're looking more at how can I stop myself from progression to such an addiction in the long run?
I suppose to bring us to a conclusion, do you want to sort of go over some of the points we've made today and just reflect on the main themes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've probably today covered three different levels on that spectrum of habits or negative habits. I think if you look at the methamphetamine example, what you'd probably take out of that is perhaps you shouldn't allow your brain to make such connections with such high dopamine activities when you know for a fact it's going to constantly compare that, probably for the rest of your life. I think when you look at porn, you probably need to be self-aware enough to say, this is detrimental for me, and it's probably got no long-term benefits whatsoever. When you look at the weight loss journey, I think what you'd get out of that is, I'm not just going to wake up tomorrow and change everything. I'm going to take it one day at a time and have more of that long-term planning and structure in place. And then over the long period, you will realise those numbers on the scale fall and you will get that physical benefit. So I think there's three levels we've covered today, all with different messages. And I mean, they're not all applicable to everyone, but I think there's something to be learnt there.
Yeah, and I think ultimately understanding that the topic is complex. People that try to paint a one-size-fits-all approach, it's not accurate. You do have to evaluate the individual situation and what's going to work for you.
100%, you know, and at the end of the day, these are just our opinions. We're not clinical psychologists by any way. We've done some research on them, of course, but it's not to point fingers and say, you're this way, you need to change everything about you. It is about assessing your own individual situation and being self-aware and honest to say, this habit's not good for me. I want to change it. How can I replace it? And how can I stick with it?
That's good.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
True North. We go again next week.